Israeli Biblical Archaeology as a Secular Religion, Judaization Strategies and the Assertion of Ownership, the Superimposition of Biblical, Talmudic and Mishnaic Names in Present-day Israel. The claim is obsessively made that the Hebrew Bible is materially realized thanks to secularizing biblical archaeology, giving Jewish history flesh and bones, recovering the ancient past, putting it in dynastic order, and returning to the archival site of Jewish identity, said 2004, 46. Biblical archaeology was always central to the construction of Israeli Jewish identity and the perceived legitimacy of the Israeli state. The debate about ancient Israel, secularist and nationalist biblical scholarship and biblical archaeology is also a debate about the modern state of Israel, most crucially because in the eyes of many people in the West, the legitimacy of Zionist Jewish restorationism depends on the credibility of the biblical portrait. One facet of that debate is the argument in the public domain over the use of the term Israel to denote the land west of the Jordan, both in ancient and modern times. The inevitable outcome of the obsession with the Hebrew Bible in Western biblical scholarship, calling the land biblical, and with its exclusive interest in a small section of the history of the land, has resulted in focusing on the Israelite identity of a land that has actually been non-Jewish in terms of its indigenous population for the larger part of its recorded history. Whitelam 1996. This state of affairs would not exist in any other part of the planet. It is due to the Hebrew Bible and its influence in the West, where an inherited Christian culture supported the notion that Palestine has always been somehow essentially the land of Israel. Traditional biblical scholarship has been essentially Zionist and has participated in the elimination of the Palestinian identity, as if 1,400 years of Muslim occupation of this land meant nothing. This focus on a short period of history a long time ago participates in a kind of retrospective colonizing of the past. It tends to regard modern Palestinians as trespassers or resident aliens in someone else's territory. The nationalist obsession with the sacred artifacts of secularizing biblical archaeology has been central to the formation of Israeli secular nationalist collective identity and Zionist nation-building since 1948. To present European Jewish identity as rooted in the land, after the establishment of Israel, the science of archaeology was summoned to the task of constructing and consolidating that identity in secular times. The rabbis, as well as the university scholars specializing in biblical archaeology, were given sacred history as their domain, said 2004, 45. Abu el-Hajj's seminal work, Facts on the Ground, explores the centrality of selective biblical archaeology in the construction of Zionist Jewish collective identity before and after 1948. Their work examined colonial archaeological exploration in Palestine, dating back to British work in the mid-19th century. Abu el-Hajj focuses on the period after the establishment of Israel in 1948, linking the academic practice of archaeology with Zionist colonization and with plans for the Judaization and repossession of the land through the renaming of Palestinian historic and geographic names. Much of this de-Arabization of Palestine is given archaeological justification. The existence of Arab names is written over by newly coined Hebrew names. This epistemological strategy prepares for the construction of an Israeli Jewish identity based on assembling archaeological fragments, scattered remnants of masonry, tables, bones and tombs, into a sort of special biography out of which the European colony of the Yishuv emerges, visible and linguistically, as Jewish national home. Abu el-Hajj 2001, 74, said 2004, 47-48. Barzak 1988, 181-191. A large number of Israeli experts on and practitioners of biblical excavations, from General Yigal Yardin and General Moshe Dayan to even General Ariel Sharon, have remarked that biblical archaeology is their privilege, Israeli science par excellence, said 2004, 45-46, Pleasure 2003. Megan Brosher, a leading Israeli archaeologist and a current member of the Israeli Government Names Committee, noted, "The Israeli phenomenon, a nation returning to its old new land, is without parallel. It is a nation in the process of renewing its acquaintance with its own lands, and here archaeology plays an important role. In this process, archaeology is part of a larger system known as Yediat Haaretz. Knowledge of the land." The Hebrew term is derived most probably from the German Landeskunde. The European immigrants found the country to which they felt, paradoxically, both kinship and strangeness. Archaeology in Israel, a sui generis state, served as a means to dispel the alienation of its new citizens. Quoted in said 2004-46, the Israeli historians, biblical scholars, archaeologists and geographers, Meron Benvenisti argues in Sacred Landscape, the buried history of the Holy Land since 1948, have reinvented and reconstructed a history and chronology of ancient Palestine based on Israeli identity politics, so as to emphasize the Jewish connection to the land, adding designations such as the biblical, Hasmonean, Mishnaic, and Talmudic. Periods. From their early Muslim period onward, however, they adopted the nomenclature of their conquerors' chronology, since in this way it was possible to divide the approximately 1,400 years of Muslim Arab rule into units that were shorter than the period of Jewish rule over the Eretz Israel-Palestine, which lasted at most for 600 years, and especially to portray the history of the country as a long period of rule by a series of foreign powers who had robbed it from the Jews, a period that ended in 1948 with the re-establishment of Jewish sovereignty in Palestine. It was thus possible to obscure the fact that the indigenous Muslim Arab population was part and parcel of the ruling Muslim peoples, and instead to depict the history of the local population, its internal wars, its provincial rulers, its contribution to the landscape, as matters lacking in importance, events associated with one or another dynasty of foreign occupiers. Benvenisti 2002, 300. While the colonial attitudes of European and North American historians and social scientists towards former colonies of the West has begun to be re-evaluated critically since the 1960s, the Israelis have chosen to consolidate the colonial tradition and settle colonial historiography in Palestine, Israel. In Israel, there has always been an obsession with the biblical memory, and the convergence between biblical excavations and Jewish settler colonization has always loomed large, but became most pronounced after the post-1967 conquests. Furthermore, Israeli biblical archaeology has remained central to secular Zionist identity politics and Israeli settler activities. Most Orthodox Jews in Israel were and still are indifferent to its findings. Elon 1997, 38. Meron Benvenisti observes that British, American, and other academics engaged in the study of the archaeology and history of their former overseas colonies have begun to re-evaluate the attitudes that prevailed during the colonial period. They have admitted grave distortions that were introduced into the history of the colonies as an outcome of Eurocentric attitudes, ignoring or erasing remaining traces of the natives' past and their material culture. In the wake of this evaluation, Amerindian, Aborigine, and native African sites were studied and restored, and a new history was written, focusing on the organic chronicles of those regions, which had been a mere footnote in the history of the European peoples. The Israelis, by contrast, chose to maintain the colonial tradition with only minor changes. Their Israeli Antiquities Administration is aware of only 2 sites in Old Jaffa, the Rebuim House, the first home of this group of early Zionist pioneers in the country, in 1882, and the first building of the first Zionist Hebrew high school, Gymnasia Herzliya, which have been declared antiquities in accordance with Article 2 of Israeli Antiquities Law of 1978. Of course, no structure of historical value to the Palestinians has been declared as a protected antiquity under Israeli law. Benvenisti 2002, 304 to 305, around Jerusalem thousands of acres of pine forests were planted by the Jewish National Fund, forests which are both intended to camouflage destroyed Palestinian villages and fashion a new pastoral, biblical landscape, create a new collective memory and give the impression of an authentic, timeless biblical landscape in which trees have been standing forever. But this natural landscape is a carefully constructed scene to camouflage the systematically expropriated land of Palestinian villages, the destruction of cultivated olive groves and the ethnic cleansing of the Nakba. The underlying intention is to obscure the locations of the Palestinian villages and prevent any cultivation of the land by non-Jews. The Israeli architects Rafi Siegel and Ayul Weizman, commenting on Israeli settlement and the creation of a pastoral biblical landscape, wrote, "In the ideal image of the pastoral landscape, integral to the perspective of colonial traditions, the admiration of the rustic panorama is always viewed through the window frames of modernity. The impulse to retreat from the city to the country reasserts the virtue of a simpler life close to nature. The recreation of the picturesque scenes of biblical landscape becomes a testimony to an ancient claim on the land. The admiration of the landscape thus functions as a cultural practice by which social and cultural identities are formed. Within this panorama, however, lies a cruel paradox, the very thing that renders the landscape biblical or pastoral, its traditional inhabitants and cultivation in terraces, olive orchards, stone buildings and the presence of livestock, is produced by the Palestinians, who the Jewish settlers came to replace. And yet, the very people who came to cultivate their green olive orchards and render the landscape biblical are themselves excluded from the panorama. The Palestinians are there to produce the scenery and then disappear. The gaze that sees a pastoral biblical landscape does not register what it does not want to see. It is a visual exclusion that seeks a physical exclusion. Like a theatrical set, the panorama can be seen as an edited landscape put together by invisible stage hands. What for the state is a supervision mechanism that seeks to observe the Palestinians is for the settlers a window on a pastoral landscape that seeks to erase them. The Jewish settlements superimpose another datum of latitudinal geography upon an existing landscape. Settlers can thus see only other settlements, avoid those of the Palestinian towns and villages, and feel that they have truly arrived, as the people without land to the land with people. Siegel and Weizman 2003, 92. There are dozens of biblical and archaeological parks in Israel run by the Israel Nature and Parks Authority, Razhut Hafiver for Haganim, a governmental organization set up in 1998. Many of these archaeological, biblical and Crusader, national heritage parks have been constructed on the ruins of Palestinian villages and towns destroyed in 1948. The negation of both the ancient Palestinian and Islamic heritage of the land by Israel's heritage industry of archaeological theme parks is very much in evidence. Today in Palestinian Safaria, destroyed by Israel in 1948, the heritage industry geared towards both the retrospective colonization of the past and the fashioning of modern Israeli collective identity. From Palestinian Majdal, Ascalon to biblical Ashkelon in 1948, the towns and villages of southern Palestine, including the towns of Bir al-Sabai, Bir Sheber, and Ul-Majdal, were completely depopulated. Ul-Majdal was established in the 16th century near the medieval Muslim city of Ascalon, a city that had a long history and a multilayered identity dating back to the ancient Philistines. Its medieval Arab name, Ascalon, preserved its ancient Palestinian name, Ascalon. With one of the oldest and largest seaport in ancient Palestine, it was one of the 5 famous cities of the Philistines: Gaza, Gath, Ascalon, Ashdod, modern Arabic toponym, Isdod, Ekron, Akir. Ul-Majdal, Ascalon, on the eve of the 1948 war, had 10,000 Muslim and Christian inhabitants, and in October 1948 thousands more refugees from nearby villages joined them. Al-Majdal was conquered by the Israeli army on the 4th of November 1948, and many of its residents and refugees fled, leaving some 2,700 inhabitants, mostly women and the elderly, behind. Orders in Hebrew and Yiddish were posted in the streets of the town, warning the soldiers to be aware of undesirable behavior on the part of the town's residents. As was customary in such instances, the Israeli intelligence officer wrote, "The behavior of the population was obsequious and adulatory." Levi 2000. In December 1948, Israeli soldiers swept through the town and deported some 500 of its remaining inhabitants. In 1949, the commanding officer of the Southern Command, Yigal Allon, demanded that the town be emptied of its Arabs. Masalha. 1997-9. This was followed by an interministerial committee decision to thin out the Palestinian population. Another ministerial committee, on abandoned property, decided to settle Al-Majdal with Jews. The town was being Judaized, and, with 2,500 Jewish residents, it was named Migdal Ad. In December 1949, more Palestinians were deported to vacate more houses for Jewish settlers, this time for discharged Israeli soldiers. In the meantime, the Israeli army made the life of those Palestinians who remained a misery, hoping they would leave. The new commanding officer of the Southern Command, Moshe Dayan, returned to the proposal of Yigal Allon. "I hope that perhaps in the coming years, there will be another opportunity to transfer these Arabs, 170,000 Israeli Arabs, out of the land of Israel," Dayan said at a meeting of the ruling Mapai party on the 18th of June. 1950, Dayan also submitted a detailed proposal for the evacuation of the Arab inhabitants of the town of Majdal. Both the army chiefs of staff agreed, and Prime Minister Ben-Gurion authorized the plan on the 19th of June 1950, Masalha 1997-9. In the summer of 1950, almost 2 years after the 1948 war, the Palestinian inhabitants of Majdal received expulsion orders and, over a period of a few weeks, were transported to the borders of Gaza. They were loaded onto trucks and dropped off at the border. The last delivery of 229 people left for Gaza on the 21st of October 1950. The Israeli officials distributed their abandoned houses among new Jewish settlers. To this very day, the Palestinian inhabitants of Al-Majdal live in the shacks and shanties of the refugee camps in Gaza. In 1956, Migdal had changed its name to the biblical-sounding Ashkelon, Levi 2000. Since then it has been kept as a purely Jewish city. Commenting on Israeli educational policies, Ismail Abu Sa'ad, of Ben-Gurion University, writes, "The education system is essential to making the displacement of indigenous history and presence official, through texts such as that quoted from the 6th grade geography curriculum in Israeli schools, which teaches Palestinian children that the history of the coastal plain began only 100 years ago, with the advent of European Jewish settlement and their transformation of this previously abandoned area. In the text, modern Jewish Tel Aviv overrides any mention of Arab Jaffa, modern Jewish Ashdod of Arab Isdod, modern Jewish Ashkelon of Arab Al-Majdal Ascalon. Modern Jewish Rishon LeZion, First in Zion, and Herzliya, and numerous other new towns are superimposed upon an unacknowledged landscape of Palestinian villages emptied and demolished in 1948. The indigenous landscape is erased from the curriculum, while it is simultaneously being erased by the curriculum, because of its absence from the official historical and geographical materials being taught about the region. Abu Sa'ad 2008, 24-25, The Erasure of the Heritage of Palestine and the Palestinians, Physically and Culturally, was summarized by Israeli political geographer Oren Yiftashel in 2008 as follows: "The act of erasure had been led, for many decades, by the Jewish state's apparatuses, those that aimed to erase the remnants of the Arab-Palestinian society that lived in the country until 1948, and to deny the catastrophe that Zionism inflicted on this nation. The erasure that came after the violence, the flight, The expulsion and the demolition of the villages is visible in all discourses in textbooks. The history that Zionist society tells itself in the political discourse, in the media, in maps, and now also in the names of the sites, roads, and junctions. Palestine, which lays under Israel, is disappearing from the Israeli-Jewish physical reality and discourse. Point 31. The new Israeli place names and landscape, fashioning a European landscape as a site of amnesia and erasure. In the first 2 decades of the state, Israelis had a deep anxiety about the discovery of the truth about the 1948 Nakba and their nightmarish prospect of Palestinian refugees returning to their towns and villages in what had become Israel. Facing the Forests, one of novelist A.B. Yehoshua's first major works, was published in 1963. It opens with the destruction of a Palestinian village in 1948 and the planting of a JNF forest on its ruins. The novel recounts the story of an Israeli student who is obsessed with the history of the Latin Crusaders. The student, looking for a break and solitude, finds a job as a forest ranger. When he arrives at the watch house in the JNF forest, he finds an Arab man whose tongue had been cut out and the man's daughter. Shortly after his arrival, the student begins to suffer from nightmares and he is constantly anticipating a catastrophe. As the summer continues, the student begins to desire the man's daughter. The tension between the two escalates and suddenly the man sets fire to the forest and the whole forest burns down. At dawn, the student turns his gaze to the fire-smoking hills, frowns. They're out of the smoke and haze, their ruined village appears before his eyes, born anew, in its basic outlines as an abstract drawing, as all things past and buried. While the student fails to see the truths unearthed by his research on the Latin Crusades, the fire reveals it. The novel ends with the destruction of the forest and the re-emergence of the Arab village, Yehoshua 1975, 385. The JNF's forests, such as the Carmel National Park, became an icon of Zionist national revival in Israel and in Israeli Hebrew literature, symbolizing the success of the European Zionist project in striking roots in the ancient homeland and sacred landscape. Children were often named after trees, and children's Hebrew literature described young trees as children, Zerubbabel 1996. Names such as Elon, tree, Oren, pine tree, Tomer and Tamer, male and female for palm tree, Amir, treetop, or Elon or Alan, oak tree, are very common in Israel. Natural woodlands of Palestine oak covered many areas of historic Palestine, especially in Upper Galilee, Mount Carmel, Mount Tabor, Arabic, Jabal al-Tur, and other hilly regions. Some local Palestinian Muslim traditions in Galilee have even attributed holiness to ancient oak trees. The ancient Palestine oak tree and its leaves have been seen as a symbol of strength and endurance not only in Palestine, but in many countries across the world. European pre-Christian and medieval Christian traditions of veneration of Palestine oak trees are well known. The leaves of the oak were also traditionally an important part of German army regalia and symbolize ranks in the U.S. Army. In ancient Palestine, this tree had its own cult in local mythology, derived from local religious traditions. It is associated with life and is supposed to have grown since the beginning of the world. Nisilaus-Caspano 2011, 132-137. But the worship of the JNF, European-style, forests in Israel has also become central to an invented Zionist secular collective memory. Israeli historian and journalist Amos Elon, who was born in Vienna as Amos Sternbach and immigrated to Palestine in 1933, changed his name to Amos Oak. In similar vein, General Yigal Allon, commander of the Parma in 1948, was born Yigal Paikovich and changed his name to the Hebrew-sounding Allon, oak tree. As we have seen above, this tradition of their ancient woods and wood worship was derived from Central European notions of romantic nationalism. In 2004, Amos Elon moved to Italy, citing disillusionment with developments in Israel since 1967. In The Israelis, Founders and Sons, Elon writes, "Few things are as evocatively symbolic of the Zionist dream and rationale as a Jewish National Fund forest." Elon 1983, 200. Israel's European-style forests and reforestation policies. Enjoy Western support. Planting a European-style forest in their sacred soil and a sacred landscape confirms the undeniable ethical value of Israel's, and by extension the West's, project in the East. Afforestation is also linked, materially and symbolically, to the European Holocaust, and thousands of trees have been planted in memory of the lost communities and individual victims. Elon 1983, 200. For Palestinians, however, few things better encapsulate the notorious role of the JNF since the Nakba. Jan-June 2010. From Yerushalayim to Orshalim, the transliteration of new Hebrew toponyms and road signs into English and Arabic, the official Judaization, Hebraicization and Biblicization schemes which began after 1948 continued into the post-1967 era. Israel began interfering with Arabic road signs and toponyms in occupied East Jerusalem immediately after June 1967. In that year it coined a new word, Orshalim. That was supposed to be the Arabic form of the Hebrew word for Jerusalem. Yerushalayim. 32. In recent years, thousands of road signs became the latest front in Israel's battle of accelerating the erasure of the Palestinian Arab toponymic heritage of the land. The pattern, which began before 1967, included the transliteration of newly coined Hebrew toponyms and road signs into both English and Arabic. In July 2009, the Israeli Transport Minister Yisrael Katz announced a new road sign scheme for all major roads in Israel, occupied East Jerusalem, and even parts of occupied West Bank to be standardized by converting the original Arabic place names into straight transliterations of the new Hebrew name. Traditionally, some road signs in Israel included names that were rendered in three languages top to bottom: Hebrew, first, English and Arabic. Under the 2009 scheme of the Transport Ministry, which was open about the political motivation behind its policy, Jerusalem, or all codes in Arabic, would be standardized throughout occupied East Jerusalem as Yerushalayim and transliterated into Arabic. Orshalim, Nazareth, or Al-Nasirah in Arabic, would be standardized into Nazrat, and Jaffa, the Palestinian port city after which Palestine's oranges became famous as Jaffa oranges, would be Yaffo. As for Palestinian Nablus, the ministry was also looking for ways to spell the Hebrew, biblical-sounding name Shechem in Arabic. 33. Today all major international airlines which fly to Ben Gurion Airport, formerly Lider Airport, which was created in 1936 during the British Mandatory period and later renamed after Israel's first Prime Minister, use the Hebrew transliteration of the Arabic toponym Jaffer, by drawing the attention of their passengers on arrival to weather in the Yaffo Tel Aviv region. Epilogue: the Palestinian multilayered identity, toponymic memory, and the diverse heritage of the land. Palestinian responses to forced depopulation and ethnic cleansing from their villages and towns are discursively rich, complex, and protean. Slyamovitz, 2002. In recent decades, novels, poems, films, plays, ethnographic and photographic documentation, maps, oral history archives, online websites, and a wide range of activities in exiled and internally displaced communities have been and are being produced, many with the aim of countering Israeli denial and correcting distortions of omission and commission that eradicate the Palestinian presence in the land. Also, a large number of books have been produced both inside Israel and at Birzeit University, all dedicated to villages that have been depopulated and destroyed. These form part of a large historical and imaginative literature in which the destroyed Palestinian villages are revitalized and their existence celebrated. Slyamovitz, 2002. In the post-1948 period, Palestinians maintained the multiple meaning of their Arabic names and the multi-layered Palestinian identity embedded in ancient names. Ashrawi 1995, 132-134, Dumarni 1995. Palestinian nationalism, both secular and religious strands, however, like all other modern nationalisms with its construction of national consciousness, is a modern phenomenon. Khalidi, R. 1998. But this must not be automatically conflated with the Palestinian social, cultural and religious identities, which are deeply rooted in the land as well as in the ancient history and toponymic memory of Palestine. Furthermore, the Palestinians, until the 1948 catastrophe, were predominantly peasants, deeply rooted in the physical and cultural landscapes of Palestine. The local dialect and the names of their villages and towns preserved the multi-layered and diverse cultural heritage of the country. Today the Palestinians are culturally and linguistically Arab and largely but not exclusively Muslim. The Palestinian Muslim population was mainly descended from local Palestinian Christians and Jews who had converted to Islam after the Islamic conquest in the 7th century and inherited many of the social, cultural, religious and linguistic traditions of ancient Palestine, including those of the Israelites, Canaanites and Philistines. Shaban 1971, 25-161, Donner 1981, Nebel and Oppenheim 2000, Rose 2010, ESLer 2011. Furthermore, the similarities between their Arabic language and Ugaritic suggests that Arabic was not a late intruder into Palestine from 638 AD onwards, following the Arab-Muslim conquest, Riyadh 2010. Also, many Palestinians are Christian Arabs who have historic roots in Palestine and a long heritage in the land where Christ lived. Commenting on the multilayered cultural identity and diverse heritage of the Palestinians, Palestinian sociologist Sami Farsoon, 1937-2005, writes, Palestinians are descendants of an extensive mixing of local and regional peoples, including the Canaanites, Philistines, Hebrews, Samaritans, Hellenic Greeks, Romans, Nabatean Arabs, tribal nomadic Arabs, some Europeans from the Crusades, some Turks, and other minorities. After the Islamic conquests of the 7th century, however, they became overwhelmingly Arabs. Thus, this mixed stock of people has developed an Arab-Islamic culture for at least 14 centuries. Farsoon 2004, the development of Palestinian nationalism in recent decades has brought with it a much greater awareness of critical archaeology and historical writing based on critical biblical studies and the question of the shared historical heritage of Palestine and the Palestinians. Thompson 2003, 1. Also, interestingly, Palestinian scholar Mazen Kumzieh has suggested, in his Sharing the Land of Canaan, a more realistic and less dichotomous approach to the debate on Canaanites, Israelites. He argued for coexistence in Palestine, Israel based on shared historical heritage and cultural and genetic affinities between their Canaanitic people, Mizrahi Jews and Palestinian Christians and Muslims. Kumzieh 2004, 28-30. See also Nebel and Oppenheim 2000. Indeed, it would not be unreasonable to argue that the modern Palestinians are more likely to be the descendants of the ancient Philistines and Israelites than Ashkenazi Jews, many of whom were European converts to Judaism. Certainly historically, in contrast to the myth of exile and return, many of the original Jewish inhabitants of ancient Palestine remained in the country but had accepted Christianity and Islam many generations later. Today, however, in contrast to the mythologized Ashkenazi Zionist and Arab nationalist historiographies, more and more archaeologists and biblical scholars are convinced that the ancestors of the Israelites had never been in Egypt and that the biblical paradigm of a military conquest of Canaan was completely fictional. Indeed, the archaeological evidence undermines, in particular, the Book of Joshua. If the exodus from Egypt and the 40-year desert journey around Sinai could not have happened and the military conquest of their fortified cities ancient Palestine, according to Deuteronomy 9 verse 1, great cities with walls sky high, were totally refuted by archaeology. Who, then, were these Israelites, Philistines or Canaanites? Palestinian digitally archived oral histories and toponymic memories of the hundreds of destroyed villages and towns have emerged in recent decades as a significant methodology not only for the construction of an alternative history of the Palestinian Nakba and memories of the lost historic Palestine, but also for an ongoing indigenous life, living Palestinian practices and a sustained human ecology. In contrast with the Israeli settler colonial heritage-style industry and a supremacist biblical archaeology, with its obsession with myth narratives and assembling archaeological fragments, indigenous Palestinians have devoted much attention to the enormously rich sedimentations of village history and oral traditions as a reminder of the continuity of native life and living practices, said 2004, 49, Masalha 2008, 123-156. Decolonizing history and reclaiming and preserving the ancient heritage and material culture of Palestine and the Palestinians is vital. There is an urgent need to teach the ancient history of Palestine and the indigenous Palestinians, Muslims, Christians, Samaritans and Jews, including the production of new and critical Palestinian textbooks for schools, colleges and universities, as well as for the millions of exiled Palestinian refugees. This understanding and teaching should encompass the new critical archaeology scholarship of Palestine and the new critical understanding of the ancient history and memories of the land.